The first thing you need to know about me is this. I was never looking for a fight with my neighborhood. I was the guy who fixed problems quietly. The guy people called when something stopped working. The guy who believed being a good neighbor meant doing a little more than what was expected. But after my homeowners association poured concrete across my driveway and tried to tell me I was the problem, I realized something important. Sometimes the person everyone depends on is the easiest person for them to ignore. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I am 41 years old, and I live in a small townhouse community outside of Columbus, Ohio, a place called Willow Creek Landing. For nearly a decade, I thought I had found the kind of neighborhood people dream about. The streets were clean. The houses looked almost identical. Everyone waved when they drove by, and the HOA board made sure every mailbox, fence, and flower bed followed the same rules. Some people loved that kind of order. Some people thought it was a little too much. I was somewhere in the middle. I understood why rules existed, but I never believed a rule should matter more than common sense. My house was the one at the bottom of the neighborhood slope. It was not the biggest house. It was not the newest. And honestly, the gray siding on my place had seen better days. But underneath that ordinary-looking home was something most of my neighbors never thought about: a complete drainage and backup control system that kept water from collecting across the entire community. Years earlier, after a major storm caused flooding issues, I offered to help the builder and the HOA understand why water kept moving toward the lower properties. I was a civil engineer by trade, so this was not just a hobby for me. I understood grading, pressure systems, runoff patterns, and how small mistakes underground could become expensive disasters above ground. Over time, I installed additional controls in my basement, upgraded pumps, maintained valves, and created a system that helped protect 12 homes around me. Nobody forced me to do it. I actually volunteered. At the time, I thought that was what neighbors did. For 8 years, I paid the electricity, replaced worn parts, handled emergency repairs, and never sent a single bill. Not one. When people thanked me, I usually laughed it off and said, "It's nothing. We all live here." Looking back, that sentence probably became my biggest mistake. Because when people receive something for free long enough, they stop seeing it as a gift. They start seeing it as something they are entitled to. The person who understood that better than anyone was our HOA president, Marissa Whitmore. Marissa lives 3 houses down from me in a perfect red brick townhouse with white shutters and a front garden that looked like it belonged in a magazine. She was organized, confident, and always carried herself like she was running a small government instead of a neighborhood association. She was not always a bad person. That is what made the situation complicated. She genuinely believed rules created peace. The problem was that somewhere along the way, she started believing enforcing those rules gave her control over people. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in early spring. I walked outside with my coffee, expecting another normal day, and immediately noticed something wrong. Across the end of my driveway was a fresh strip of concrete, about 18 inches wide, blocking part of my entrance. It was clean, gray, and still looked new. Someone had poured it overnight. There was a bright orange notice attached to it. The paper said there was a setback violation and that the driveway extension had to be corrected. I stood there for a few seconds just staring at it because I honestly thought there had been some mistake. 6 months earlier, I had submitted the exact plans for that driveway adjustment. The HOA Architectural Committee had approved it. I had the emails. I had the documents. I had done everything the right way. So I called Marissa. She answered after 2 rings, and before I even finished explaining, she already sounded like she knew exactly why I was calling. I said, "Marissa, someone poured concrete across my driveway. This was approved last year. Can you explain what happened?" There was a pause, and then she said, "The committee reviewed it again. The measurement was wrong. The extension crosses the setback line." I looked down at the concrete and almost laughed. "You're telling me after 6 months you discovered 6 inches? Her response was simple. "Rules are rules, Ethan." That sentence bothered me more than the concrete itself, not because of the driveway, but because it showed me something I had been ignoring for years. She was not interested in solving a problem. She was interested in proving that she had authority. I told her I wanted to discuss the documents and find a reasonable solution. She replied, "You can park on the street until it's resolved." Then she hung up. I stood there holding my phone, looking at the driveway I paid for, the house I owned, and the neighborhood I had spent years helping, and for the first time, I asked myself a question I never thought I would ask. If they were willing to treat me like a nuisance after everything I had done for them, how long had they actually been taking me for granted? That night, I did something I had not done in a long time. I stopped looking at the situation like a neighbor and started looking at it like an engineer. I walked downstairs into my basement, turned on the lights, and stood in front of the system that most people in Willow Creek Landing did not even know existed. The sound of the pumps running had always been background noise to me. Something familiar, almost comforting. But that night, every click, every vibration, every moving valve felt different. I looked at the control panel, the backup system, the pressure regulators, and all the equipment I'd installed and maintained over the years, and I realized something uncomfortable. 12 homes were protected by a system they never paid for, never maintained, and probably never even understood. For 8 years, I had been carrying a responsibility that technically belonged to the community, and nobody had ever asked a single question about it. They only noticed when something stopped working. That was the part that bothered me the most. Not the concrete, not Marissa, not even the disrespect. It was the fact that I had spent years making sure everyone else stayed comfortable while nobody cared whether I was being treated fairly. I sat down at my workbench that night with a notebook and started writing everything down. Maintenance dates, replacement costs, emergency calls, electrical expenses, parts I had purchased, hours I had spent working in that basement while everyone else was watching television upstairs. The numbers added up quickly. It was not just a machine in my basement. It was a service that had value. The next morning, I made a decision that some people would probably call harsh, but I saw it differently. I was not going to destroy anything. I was not going to damage anyone's property. I was simply going to stop pretending my time and my expertise were worthless. I switched the system from automatic community support mode to manual operation. The equipment was still there. It still worked. But from that moment forward, activation would require my approval. Before anyone panics and thinks I was trying to hurt people, understand this. The system was never designed to be my personal responsibility forever. There was no agreement, no payment structure, no maintenance contract. There was just me quietly keeping everything alive because I thought people appreciated it. I placed a notice near the access panel. It was simple and professional. Drainage system available by manual activation. Emergency service fee applies. I did not make threats. I did not insult anyone. I simply changed the arrangement, and then I waited. The first day brought a light drizzle, nothing serious. I turned the system on for my own home and watched the water move exactly the way it was supposed to. Nobody noticed. The neighborhood looked normal. Kids rode bikes. People walked their dogs. Everyone continued living inside the illusion that everything worked automatically because it always had. The second day brought heavier rain. A few neighbors started asking questions. One person knocked on my door and said, "Hey, is everything okay with the drainage?" I smiled and said, "Everything is fine. The system is operating under its current settings." They looked confused, but nobody asked the obvious question. Who had been paying for it all these years? Then came the third day. The weather forecast changed overnight. A major storm moved through the area, and within 4 hours, nearly 2 inches of rain hit Willow Creek Landing. That was when people started realizing something was different. Around noon, I heard someone knocking hard on my front door. It was my neighbor, Daniel Harper, who lived 2 houses uphill from me. His face looked completely different from the relaxed guy I usually saw grilling in his backyard. "Ethan, something's wrong," he said. "The basement floor drain is backing up." I looked at him for a moment and then calmly asked, "Did you contact the HOA?" He hesitated. "I called Marissa. She said you needed to fix whatever you changed." I nodded and showed him the notice near my basement entrance. He read it silently. The confidence disappeared from his face. "Wait, this was you?" he asked. I replied, "No, Daniel. The system was always mine. I was just maintaining it for everyone else." By late afternoon, more calls started coming in. 6 different homes were having problems. People who had never asked how the system worked were suddenly very interested in who controlled it. And then, at exactly 8,000 that evening, Marissa Whitmore showed up at my door. The woman who had confidently told me rules are rules that morning now looked exhausted. Her perfectly styled hair was messy, her makeup was running slightly, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked like someone who did not have the answer. She did not say hello. She walked straight to the point. "Ethan, you need to turn it back on." I looked at her and said, "That's interesting. This morning, I was told I could park on the street. Now suddenly my driveway and my basement equipment are important." Her expression tightened. "This is not the time for this." I replied, "Actually, I think this is exactly the time for this." She crossed her arms. "You are creating a problem for the entire community." I almost smiled because that sentence was exactly backwards. "Marissa, I didn't create this problem. I just stopped hiding it." She told me the concrete issue was separate. She said my driveway violation had nothing to do with drainage. But I shook my head. "That's where you're wrong. Everything is connected. The person you decided to push around happens to be the person keeping your neighborhood functional." For a moment, neither of us said anything. The rain was still hitting the windows behind her, the same rain that had exposed everything. Then she changed tactics. Her voice became colder. "If you don't cooperate, the HOA will take legal action." I looked at her and realized something. She still believed this was about winning. She still believed the person with the authority was the person with the power. So I simply said, "Then I guess we should let the paperwork decide." And I closed the door. The next morning, I did not call a lawyer. I did not post angry messages online. I did something much more effective. I opened my laptop, pulled up my engineering records, and started writing a proposal. Not a complaint, not a threat, a contract. Because if Willow Creek Landing wanted to treat this like a business relationship, then I was finally going to make sure they understood the value of what they had been receiving for free. I spent the next several hours putting everything together, and for the first time in 8 years, I stopped thinking like Ethan the neighbor and started thinking like Ethan the engineer. I opened every folder on my computer, pulled out old receipts, maintenance records, repair notes, and every little piece of evidence I had collected without even realizing it mattered. There were invoices for replacement pumps, electrical work, emergency parts, and countless hours I had spent crawling around that basement trying to keep everything running. Looking at all of it together was almost strange because each individual moment had felt small. A broken valve here, a clogged line there, a late-night repair during a storm, a quick adjustment before heading to work. I never thought about the total because I was helping people I lived beside. But seeing 8 years of work organized in front of me made one thing painfully clear. What I had been giving away for free had real value. So I built a proposal, not a complaint, not a threat, and not some emotional revenge letter. I created a professional service agreement, the kind of document that should have existed from day one. I calculated the actual yearly cost of maintaining the drainage system, including inspections, repairs, replacement parts, electricity, and emergency response. The number came out to $8,500 per year, divided between the 12 homes that depended on it. I also included a retroactive maintenance charge for the previous 8 years, but I reduced it heavily because I still wanted to be fair. I was not trying to destroy anyone financially. I was trying to make people understand that responsibility does not become worthless just because someone is willing to carry it quietly. I added the cost of removing the concrete that had been placed across my driveway and included a new requirement that any future drainage-related decisions within the community had to be reviewed by someone qualified before changes were made. No more guessing. No more approving projects without understanding the consequences. No more treating complicated systems like they were just another HOA rule. When I sent the proposal to the board, I expected a battle. Honestly, I was prepared for it. I expected Marissa Whitmore to come in with another speech about regulations and authority. I expected her to focus on the 6 inches of concrete because that was the argument she had chosen. But something interesting happened. The emergency HOA meeting that night was unlike any meeting I had ever attended. Usually, those meetings were filled with arguments about small things. A mailbox color, a fence height, someone's holiday decoration staying up too long. The kind of issues that seem important when everything else is going smoothly. But that night, everyone showed up because they finally understood the seriousness of what was happening underneath their homes. I walked into the meeting carrying my folder, and for the first time, nobody looked at me like the guy with the driveway problem. They looked at me like the person who had been keeping their neighborhood protected. Marissa sat at the front table with the rest of the board. She still looked professional, but something had changed. The confidence was not the same. The person who had told me rules are rules was now sitting in a room full of homeowners asking questions she could not easily answer. One neighbor named Chris raised his hand and said, "Ethan, I need to understand something. You've been maintaining this entire system yourself?" I nodded. "For how long?" he asked. I looked around the room and said, 8 years. The room became completely silent. Another homeowner said, "Why didn't the HOA know about this?" I took a second before answering because the truth was simple, because nobody ever asked. That sentence seemed to hit harder than any number on my proposal, because everyone realized the problem was not just money, it was awareness. They had become so used to everything working that they stopped wondering why it worked. After a long discussion, the board agreed to move forward with my agreement. They signed a 15-year maintenance contract, paid 2 years up front, and officially recognized the drainage system as shared community infrastructure. They also approved a clause protecting me from future HOA interference involving the system. It was not about giving me special treatment. It was about making sure the person responsible for maintaining something critical actually had the authority to protect it. But the moment I remember most did not happen during the meeting. It happened a few days later. It was Monday morning when I heard a knock on my door. I opened it and saw Marissa standing there holding a folder. For a second, I thought maybe another argument was coming, maybe another accusation, maybe another attempt to prove she was still in control. But she simply handed me the folder and said, "This is from the board." Inside was a written apology. It was not dramatic. There were no big emotional speeches. It was actually very simple. The HOA acknowledged that the driveway situation had been handled poorly, that my previous contributions had been overlooked, and that the community should have communicated with me before taking action. I realized her twice. And honestly, that meant more to me than the money. Because the money was never the reason I was upset. The reason was feeling invisible. Feeling like everything I had done only mattered when people needed something from me. Later that afternoon, the same crew that poured the concrete came back to remove it. I stood outside watching them break apart the strip that had started this entire conflict. It was strange because a few weeks earlier, that concrete felt like a symbol of everything wrong with the situation. It represented control. It represented assumptions. It represented what happens when people stop seeing each other as neighbors and start seeing each other as positions on a committee. But as the concrete disappeared and my driveway returned to normal, I realized something. I was not standing there because I had defeated anyone. I was standing there because things were finally fair again. After the crew left, I went downstairs and reconnected the automatic controls on the drainage system. The pump started running, the valves opened, and that familiar mechanical hum filled the basement again. But this time, it felt different. Everyone knew what that sound meant. They knew there was work behind it. They knew there was responsibility behind it. They knew that the systems protecting their homes were not magic. They existed because someone cared enough to maintain them. Looking back now, I still think about how easily everything could have been avoided. One conversation could have changed the entire outcome. If Marissa had simply called me and said, "Ethan, we have a concern about the driveway. Can we look at this together?" I probably would have worked with her. That is who I was. That is who I had always been. But respect has to work both ways. You cannot spend years benefiting from someone's knowledge, time, and effort, then suddenly treat that same person like a problem when they ask to be heard. The biggest lesson I learned was not about concrete, drainage, or HOA politics. It was about boundaries. Helping people is important. Being a good neighbor matters. But kindness does not mean your effort has no value. Sometimes people only understand what you provide when they have to live without it. For 8 years, I kept those homes safe because I cared about my community. In the end, I did not need revenge. I did not need anyone embarrassed. I just needed people to finally recognize what had been right in front of them the entire time. So now I want to hear what you think. If you were in my position, after spending 8 years maintaining a system that protected your neighbors without getting paid, would you continue doing it out of goodwill? Or would you create a formal agreement from the beginning? Do you think I handled the situation fairly? Or should I have taken a different approach? Leave your thoughts in the comments because this is the kind of situation where there is always a debate. Some people believe neighbors should help each other without expecting anything in return. Others believe true appreciation means recognizing the value of someone's time before they are forced to prove it. I want to know where you stand.